Previously on Lloyd Meets the Mormons. I've started to get more engaged with the local expat scene here in Croatia. And one thing that became very quickly apparent when I started doing this was that there was a Mormon presence. In their minds, they are engaging me in a study. In my mind, I am trying to sow some seeds.
When I heard your story, it was really emotional for me.
I asked them what the bottom line was. What's your goal in preaching to people? I may have already reached a point where they are being affected by our conversations more than they perhaps expected to be. So, I just had my final conversation with the LDS Church members. Mormons! Let's just call them Mormons, I'm sorry if you're watching. So I've basically ended it. I think if I hadn't ended it, they would conceivably have continued to meet with me indefinitely. They're just, I don't know, it just seems to have reached a point, and I even kind of expressed this to them, where I've expressed my viewpoint about reason and logic versus belief and dogma every which way, and they've not come up with anything really that that would make me think differently about our approach to reality and how we arrive at what's true and what isn't true. They are, at least as far as I can tell, heavily indoctrinated. And when I say they, it's kind of difficult to pin it down to who exactly I'm talking about, because, of course, the missionaries that I've been speaking to have been rotated. I've probably spoken to, I'm going to say, 4 or 5 different individuals across all of the meetings that I've had, and I can't even remember at this point how many meetings it is. I think it might be 7. If it's wrong, Tibor will put a caption in. I think that was my 7th meeting. And my homework was to study the introduction to the Book of Mormon. And when I was first asked to do that, it was explained to me that the introduction would answer my issue about the language of the Book of Mormon, namely the fact that it's written in Shakespearean English, as a text that was compiled in the 19th century. And I was promised that there would be an answer to that question in the introduction. And of course I read it. The introduction itself is just 1 page. There's nothing in there at all that gives any, even addresses the issue of language of the Book of Mormon. So I don't quite know what the South African lady who suggested that had in mind. And when I brought it up this time, nothing was forthcoming. So that was all a bit odd and a bit confusing. And there was even a part of our conversation today where the South African missionary made me restate my objection to the language and explain why it was an issue. So I had to go through it all over again. And honestly, that's been, I think, one of the most exhausting things about these conversations. Although it's been very educational and interesting to be able to study the same dynamics that you see in Jehovah's Witnesses in the LDS Church, it's been very frustrating for me to make arguments or present ideas, or you could say objections, and for them to say, oh, that's an interesting point, we'll have a think about that, or thank you for sharing that. We don't really have anything to say in response. It's almost like they're proud to shy away or to back away from anything that contradicts their beliefs and not even try to square the circle. And it's been very, very frustrating, I must say, over all of the meetings that we've had, to see them play this game. And I know they're not consciously doing it, but play this game of, oh, that's a good point. You've given us something to think about there, and then it never gets followed up on, to the point where you're thinking, well, that seems to indicate that I've got you, that I've presented an argument that you can't answer because I'm right and you're wrong. It's been really frustrating, and I tactfully expressed that to them, that it's felt at times as though I've just been raising sometimes the same objection 2 or 3 times and it's never been answered. It was interesting that I did my homework by reading the introduction to the Book of Mormon, and they didn't do their homework because I didn't ask them to. They said that they would read Romans chapter 9 on the issue of predestination. Romans chapter 9, of course, talking about vessels of wrath made fit for destruction, and saying, how dare you even ask why God would make his creation so that they're born as vessels of wrath fit for destruction. They said that they would read the chapter, and both of them confessed. I think the understudy, the Padawan, had at least browsed through it, but neither of them had looked at it really. I suppose that tells the story of the whole series of meetings. I'm willing to put the legwork in here. There was that one meeting where the South African lady very charmingly wrote up that big page of notes, but apart from that, it's just been a frustrating exercise, and to be completely honest, I'm glad it's over. What else? Oh yeah, when I was doing my homework in the introduction, reading the introduction, I read on to the testimony of Joseph Smith. So there's like 2.5 pages at the beginning of the Book of Mormon where Joseph Smith is giving his version of how the Book of Mormon came to be. And there were 2 things that I raised about that. The first being that you get to like 1.5 pages in, and Joseph Smith summarizes the encounter with Moroni, saying that, what did he say? I realized, something along the lines of, I realized that we'd been speaking for the entire night. And I made the point to the 2 ladies, well, let's say 8 hours. Typically when someone goes to bed, they might expect or hope to have 8 hours sleep. Let's say it was 8 hours. You're telling me that everything worthwhile in a conversation that took 8 hours has been summed up in 1.5 pages, because that's the point at which he says, we had this conversation and I realized it had lasted all night because the cock crowed. That's it. The cock crowed, signaling the morning, and I realized we'd been talking all night. And I'm thinking, 8 hours of conversation, and at least a paragraph of the text in the 1.5 pages is obsessing over the robe, the fact that Moroni is wearing a robe. And I kind of joked to them, I said, simply saying he wore a robe would have sufficed for me, instead of the big long paragraph that we get where he says every which way that Moroni was wearing a robe. So I mentioned that, and I said, oh yeah, of course, at the end of that passage it says, there's more that can be said about this conversation, but to know about that you need to read this book. So I guess you have to read another book to know what was in that conversation, but why not have everything in one neat piece of text if it was so important for people to know about? And the other issue was there was a paragraph. I'm not going to read it. I'm done with recounting everything. There was a paragraph in Joseph Smith's testimony where he specifically spoke about the day of judgment, or that there being a disastrous impending, basically apocalypse with famines and pestilences. and that all of this would occur in this generation. It says that in the opening pages of the Book of Mormon, in the testimony of Joseph Smith, and I made them look up Deuteronomy 18 verse 20, where of course it says that you're first of all to kill false prophets, and if we're asking what constitutes a false prophet, it's someone who prophesies something and it doesn't happen. And I said, well, quite apart from triggering me with all this talk about destruction and pestilence and the last days, it was interesting that it specifically said that this would happen in this generation. And I said, what that means is that Joseph Smith, who's written this, and let's remember he's a prophet, and they were like nodding, yeah, he's a prophet. Well, he's made a prediction, and he's set a time limit on it, and said it's going to happen in this generation. And I said, my history's a little vague here, but I don't recall there being an apocalypse at any point from when this was written until now. I've come bloody close to one a few times, but no, there hasn't been an apocalypse. It took them a while to even register what I was saying, and I even had to explain to them about the word generation and the way Jehovah's Witnesses have changed the meaning of generation in Matthew 24, and how really, generation has, when we say generation, we mean something specific. And they were already trying to kind of shrug it off as saying, oh, this is just talking about a period of time. And I said, well, why doesn't it just say period of time? Why does Joseph Smith specifically use the word generation, which we take to mean people living at that time? It seems fairly obvious that Joseph Smith, the prophet Joseph Smith, right there in his testimony, makes a prediction and gives us a means of finding out whether it's false or not. In other words, it's a falsifiable prediction because there's a deadline for it to be fulfilled, and it wasn't fulfilled. So they seemed all a little bit bewildered by all of that, and it was a little bit disappointing. I also told them about my experience on holiday and briefly summarised what I said in my What is Truth video, thumbnail here, if Tibor is gracious. I summarised what was said in that video, and they seemed to like the story and the way I told it and everything, and they seemed to be intrigued by it, but it was obvious to me that it had sort of sailed over their heads by some of the things that they said afterwards. For example, the lady from South Africa said, we're all only human and we all have only one perspective and we can only see what's in front of us. And I said, that's just not true. I said, if we're trying to answer the really big questions, then we don't just have our perspective, we have the perspective of billions of other people. And in the case of the scientific community, when they're trying to discover scientific truths, they get to do tests and have hypotheses and try to prove and disprove hypotheses. That's how we arrive at truth. It's not just about one person's perspective. So overall, again, frustrating. I was at one point starting to kind of feel like a seed might have been sown, but now I'm more thinking that perhaps the seed wasn't sown and it's just the wrong point in their lives to even be having these conversations. So I respectfully ended our discussions, and it was quite touching that even after ending them, they were still saying, if you want us to do any service, just let us know. There's loads of us. We'll come and help you. By which I mean, I don't know, help me with moving furniture, or what are we talking about here? But they seem to want to do stuff for me. And they also, which I thought was really lovely, invited me to play football with them again. Even though I've made it clear that I'm not convinced and that I'm not meeting with them anymore, which I thought was really interesting. But anyway, thus concludes my conversations with the LDS Church missionaries. I'm going to go and get some ice cream now. I hope this series has been helpful for you. It's certainly been enlightening for me to have these encounters. So yes, hopefully it's been useful in some way, whether you're watching as an atheist, as a Jehovah's Witness, or maybe as an LDS Church member. But that's all I have time for. Thank you so much for watching. I'm going to go and get an ice cream.